There's only 2 states in the United States that still ban people being able to carry concealed handguns, Illinois and Wisconsin. And there's a good chance that at least one and possibly both of those states will change their laws after this election. And we have 40 states with right to carry laws like Texas does. 8 states which have more restricted may issue. Right to carry laws mean once you meet certain objective criteria, you're a certain age, you apply for a permit, you pass a criminal background check, you meet the training requirements if there are any, and the permit's automatically granted. The 8 May states may have those rules, but then in addition, they may also require that you get permission from some local public official by demonstrating that you have a certain need to go and carry the permanent concealed handgun. Now, just as an aside, Texas actually has a relatively restrictive right to carry law. You have about, as I mentioned before, over 410,000 people right now in the state with concealed carry permits. Compared to something like Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has less than half the population that Texas has, but they have, I guess, about 720,000 people right now with concealed carry permits. Why do they have not quite twice as many with half the population? And the reason is very simple. It has to do with the differences in the laws. Texas, to get a concealed handgun permit, if you're under 65, you've got to pay $140. You have to undergo 10 hours of training. You have to go 10 hours of training to renew your permit. In Pennsylvania, it's about a $20 fee to go and get your permit, and there's no training requirement. Plus, Texas has still a relatively long list, including campuses, where you're not allowed to go and carry a permanent concealed handgun. Pennsylvania has no such list. The only places that are excluded are places which are banned under federal law. And you see these rules have a big impact. You charge more, fewer people get permits, but it also changes the mix of people who get permits. My research on concealed carry indicates to me that the people who benefit the most from concealed carry are basically poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas. And when you go and you raise a fee, not only do you have fewer people getting permits, but you also see a mix in the type of people who get permits. You basically squeeze out particularly those people who benefit the most from having a permit. And this is a type of issue that I think is going to come up more with like the DC and Chicago new gun laws with the huge fees that they have for people being able to go and get permits, because the Washington Post did a study a little while ago which claimed that it took about $500 for them to go through the process to register a handgun. And so that basically means to me it's basically only going to be fairly wealthy individuals who are going to be able to go and get the permits, not the people who would benefit the most from having a gun to be able to go and protect themselves. Now, one of the reasons why I think people have the perceptions that they do about concealed carry and kind of concerns about campuses is due to media coverage. Most people get their information about guns from the news media. When was the last time you listened to the national evening news broadcast and heard a story about somebody using a gun to protect themselves or protect somebody else? My guess is it's probably pretty hard for you to recall such a story. But probably without trying at all, you can recall what seem to be hundreds or even thousands of stories of bad things that have happened with guns. The FBI has something called the National Crime Victimization Survey, where they survey about 150,000 people each year to try to get information on the number of crimes that occurred. Because we could just go and look at gun crimes reported to police. In any given year, there are about 200,000 to 250,000 gun crimes reported to police. The problem is, a lot of crimes are never reported to police. So, for example, rape. Only about half of rapes are reported to police. Well, how do we know that only half, or think that only half of rapes are reported to police? We have these large surveys that can go and estimate how many rapes occurred and then compare it to how many are reported. Well, we do the same thing with guns, and so rather than the reported 200 to 250,000, we find that the surveys indicate that there are about 400 to 450,000 gun crimes a year. Twice as much as what were reported. Good reason to go and do the survey. But those same types of surveys indicate that Americans use guns defensively about 2 million times a year. So that means Americans use guns defensively about 4 to 5 times more frequently to stop crimes than they use them to commit crimes. But my guess is if we were going to go ask most people about that, they think the ratio goes in the opposite direction and maybe even more lopsided in the other direction. And that's because they get their notions of the costs and benefits of guns from listening to the media. And if they only hear about bad things that happen and never hear about the benefits, it's not too surprising that they come to those conclusions. Now, one thing I can say in the defense of media, you know, it's a key fact. About 95% of the time that people use guns defensively, they merely have to brandish it for the criminal to break off an attack. Rarely is the criminal killed. Fewer than 1 out of every 1,000 times that people use guns defensively. So let's say you're editor of a news bureau, and you have 2 stories that come across your desk. One where there's a dead body on the ground, sympathetic person like a victim. And another case where, let's say, a woman's brandished a gun, the criminals run away, no shots are fired, no dead body on the ground, no crime actually committed. You're not even sure what crime might have been committed if it hadn't been stopped. Which story is more newsworthy? I think anybody in this room would honestly have to say that the first story is much more newsworthy than the second. We may care about both stories from a policy perspective, but in terms of what the media should cover, it explains, I think, a lot about why they cover the things that they cover there. I don't think that explains all of it, though, because when you talk about these types of multiple victim public shootings, there's a particular type of bias that exists. My guess is, for example, that relatively few people know that over 25% of the multiple victim public school shootings have been stopped by citizens well before uniformed police were able to arrive. And the reason why they're unlikely to know that is that when those cases occur, only about 1% of the news stories on those incidents will mention that fact. If you look at when police stop a multiple victim public shooting, about 34% of the news stories will mention how those attacks ended. So for example, if you look at the first of the public school shootings in October 1997 at Pearl, Mississippi High School, if you go and do a Nexus search, this which originally was supposed to be sponsored by the Federalist Society, which would have been all lawyers in the law school. So they would know this, but there's something called Nexus or Westlaw. If you use a Nexus search, what you can find in the 1 month after that attack, you'd see 687 separate news stories about the incident. Of those 600, basically what had happened was there was a assistant principal there at the school, a former Marine, had a permit to carry a concealed handgun, apparently regularly up until the end of 1995 when the Safe School Zone Act was passed, he regularly kept his handgun with him on school property. After the ban was passed, he would park his car more than 1,000 feet off of school property in order to obey the law. And when the attack started that day, he literally had to run a half-mile to get his gun and a half-mile back. But he still was able to hold the attacker at point-blank range on the ground for over 5.5 minutes before the police arrived. The attacker was in the process of leaving the high school to go across the street to the middle school where he was going to continue his attack. Now, there are 687 separate news stories. 19 of them will mention the assistant principal in any way. 13 of the 19 mention that the assistant principal had something to do with stopping the attack. And 10 of the 13 mentioned that he used his gun to stop the attack. 8 of those news stories were in local media near where the attack had occurred, but 2 of them were on national news. One was on ABC World News Now at 4 a.m. This is kind of the over-the-night ABC News broadcast. And the other one was on a show they used to have on CNN Early Prime, that played about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But those were the only 10 mentions. And I can go through attack after attack, and you regularly will see about only 1% of those news stories will mention that that's the case. And I think it has a big impact on people's perceptions. I talk to people in the media, I do work for people in the media, and I've tried to get them to go and mention things like, did these attacks, these multiple victim public shootings attacks, occur in gun-free zones? Because essentially what you find is that all the multiple victim public shootings involving 4 or more victims always occur when they're in public in gun-free zones. And I think it would make some difference in the debate after a while if even once in a while the media would say, and another one of these attacks, just like the one today, fortunately nobody was killed, occurred in a place where permanent concealed handguns are not allowed.